These are quite interesting because they work from slicing up of the Yoxman. All these figures were sliced on a bandsaw and then reconstructed and reconfigured. So, for example, you can see here the back of that guy, all these lines.
Yeah.
So they were a series of figures that all filled the tables, all that were cut up, and then I restacked the figures to create these pairs, and they were all done during lockdown. And so they were all about these characters kind of like not quite understanding what the world they were in was happening, what was happening, and everything was tilting at the same time. And this is what Perugian Pull is all about. This one, for example, was the kick-off, and this was all about the magnetic North Pole. In the middle of lockdown, the first lockdown, shifted from Alaska to Siberia, and it was almost as if the whole axis of the world through lockdown and COVID was shifting. Wow. So all these figures, like suddenly you are like on the ocean, you know, of a boat, boof, and they had to shift. So there was a whole community of these people that were confused at the world outside, and just kind of every morning would greet me, and they were all like, "Laurence, what's happening out there? What's going on?" You know. So these extraordinary heads came, you know, these extraordinary faces.
There's curiosity in the face.
Yeah,
isn't there?
there's like a puzzlement, a kind of slight beguilement, and kind of moving with the waves and moving with a new energy and a new time. They also felt like, you know, those incredible, I've forgotten her name, the photographer who did those Dust Bowl photographs in the American Midwest in the Great Depression.
Oh, yeah,
These characters that are sort of standing in front of like huts that have completely disappeared. They had that kind of feel about them as well, you know, kind of hardship. And there's kind of painting of the faces, almost like Freudian faces. But here's a kind of elements of them all looking in one direction, peering. So here they were, and every morning I was greeted by these characters who were just looking at me. So I'd open the door and there were like a load of meerkats going, huh? What's happening out there? I don't know. I've got here, there's no roadblocks. We're here, guys, let's carry on, you know. So a whole community built in the studio, and it was fascinating, kind of psychologically.
I just wanted to jump in there and maybe ask you about community now, because community's been something that you have worked with throughout your career.
Yes.
You've built communities around your workplace, and can you just tell me about how that?
Well, I mean, effectively, we'll talk about the Royal College later, but basically bronze casting requires other people to help you. So you have to have help, and therefore you often, because there's only one furnace, etc., have to share facilities.
Yeah.
So you end up with this kind of shared workshop scenario very, very quickly. And if you're building your own foundries and stuff, then you need people to help. So there was that kind of energy to begin with. And then I came back to Suffolk after studios in Railway Arches, etc., in London in Bow in the 1980s, and basically people were being murdered next door, and every morning after a weekend away I'd come back and there'd be acid broken into my studio, and someone would have thrown acid all over the bloody studio, and all the work I'd done would be, you know, burnt. It's like puddles. And it happened, you know, quite a lot. I think someone decided that it was quite fun to just destroy my life, and so I thought, you know what, I came from Suffolk, and I thought, I think I know there's all these barns, you know, just dying over there, you know, and I know the farmers, you know. So I came out and found a place called Clockhouse. This beautiful old Victorian buildings and walled gardens, etc. And it had been an old art, kind of private art place, art school, run by Bridget Herritz and Jane Trutsey and her mother Audrey Pilkington. And they had this kind of art school, which was a fantastic dynamic. And it was all through the late 70s and 80s, but it finished. Yeah. And there was a sheds at the bottom of a garden, and I moved in, and the landlords were kind of absentee. They lived in Berlin, so all quite exotic. They'd got property on the Berlin Wall, and when the Berlin Wall came down, quids in. So they spent a lot of time quids in Berlin, you know. And so I was in this kind of magical fantasy world in Bruges Yard with this foundry, and with a Bentley next to my furnace. About the first early bronze pours, there was a Bentley and my dustbin furnace and a hoover, and I would watch the paint blister and the tyres go slightly warm on this Bentley as I was trying to melt bronze down, you know. So it was a bit horrifying. Anyway, I was there.
Is this your first
That
foundry that you set?
Yeah, that was the first ever. It was, except whilst at the Royal College of Art, I would do my holidays in summer and or Easter. I would build them in my parents' back garden
Okay.
in Snape, and there was not much room in the garden and the windows, so I'd dig a hole in the back garden and build a furnace, nick my mother's Hoover, because you have to have air, and the propane gas, create these bloody great flames, and her bedroom windows would, again, like the Bentley, would buckle to and fro, you know. They'd be inside looking, their faces would warp, looking at the heat coming off this erratic furnace, you know. So no, they were, the early ones were in, experimental foundries were in Snape and my parents' gardens. And then I tried to build, the whole history of my casting is coming back from Italy. At the Royal College of Art. I was very lucky to go there at a time when there was only 2 students taken on a year for this, what was called the Foundry course. This is after my degree at Canterbury, where I first discovered bronze casting and the lost wax method, which is a magical method. It's a method which is an extraordinary combination of materials. You know, everything's liquid and everything's hard, everything's solid, and then you lose sculptures. You make a sculpture, you make a mould of it, and the sculpture literally becomes negative, it becomes air. And then you make it real again, it becomes wax, and it's like a figure. And then you put another mould and you melt it away, it becomes liquid. It's like, you know, a weird thing, it just becomes a puddle. You're constantly kind of losing your figures and you're risking everything, the existence of your form, and it became so engaging. And then you end up with this bronze which will last, you know, centuries. So you have this kind of incredible ethereal, kind of mysterious process which ends up becoming, you know, everlasting, really. So you're kind of dealing with, you know, ephemeral kind of immortality as well as a complete mortality. It's a very strange thing.
It's a contradiction.
Yeah, and the older I get, kind of, you know, I used to make sculptures which kind of acknowledge the process, and it was all about leaving runners and risers on all the imperfections. But now, as I get older, I'm kind of much more kind of metaphysical about the process, and I think a lot about bodies disappearing and reappearing, and the whole kind of sense of how it would feel to be in that process and travelling through this whole kind of bronze world, you know, as a human going through this, you know.
You're talking about the human and the human form. Is this something that you knew was going to be your kind of main source of inspiration? What is it about the human form? Is it everlasting question?
I mean, the Seybold Rings of Saturn book was a big thing for me, actually, when I first discovered it, you know, God knows how long ago. But it was a real shock, because basically it's a man, a melancholic German, walking from Lowestoft to Butley, really, which was my life. And I couldn't believe the guy did the walk, and not only in the walk was he talking about where he was and all my favourite places in the world, but he was departing and going on flights of fancy and journeys and researches all over the planet. And at that point I realised that Suffolk and my home patch could be the spine, could be the foundation of research that could take me all over the world. And that was really, I thought, I'm in the right place. This guy has given it to me. So the Royal College, okay, so in Canterbury, I went from Lowestoft College of Art, which grew out of Leiston High School, which is where I was. I was at Leiston High School, which is now Old Valley High. And Leiston at that time, in the 70s, education 80s, was not the great thing it is now. And the school teachers, the great teachers there, Simon Raven was there, was teaching there. Yeah. He was teaching social health education, and he was head of year 4. He was the first person I ever met at Leiston High School, believe me.
Amazing.
Simon, your name check, man, your history's out. And then there are other 2 people around now who know me still, so I can't diss Leiston too heavily. But Leiston was tough. Leiston was a school. Anyway, so I didn't do too well at Leiston School. I ended up with an O-level grade B in art, which I was very pleased with, and a history C. The rest was maths, was CSE grade 5. Bad. So they said, look, you're not good enough to stay in the 6th form, Laurence. You're a very nice bloke. You tried to burn the school down. That wasn't good. You were the last person to be caned in Leiston High School. Really, I think you're a nice guy, we like you, you've got potential to move on, but you're not working here, mate. So they said, go and, you're good at art, you can draw, go and, so I went to Ipswich, thinking that's the big city, I'm going to go to Ipswich, and here's my drawings of album covers and leather jackets for the bikers. I used to do leather jackets for the bikers. And I had pictures of them, and I went to Ipswich College and I showed them in the old art school, and they rejected me. I thought, oh great, my life's going down the pan. And then I went to Lowestoft. Lowestoft sort of liked my Pink Floyd album covers. And they said, like, you can stay. So Lowestoft gave me the chance, which is brilliant. I love. That's why, my heart opened up in Lowestoft. And
what was the practice that you were looking at there? What kind of opened you up with their particular?
Well, I mean, it was those kind of first slide talks. It was like, this incredible tutor called Bob Jose. It's like a raven, black raven with blue eyes. He would appear in front of the slide projector, and all the motored light, beaming lights, and it was like cubism. A kid from Leiston High School, cubism. It's like, ism. What the hell is that? And before you know it, it's like, you go around the figure, you draw something. That is mind blowing. That is mind blowing. I suddenly understand, and suddenly life took off. It was like, whoa. And then the next week it was Impressionism, the next week it was like, it just went crazy. And then they showed films, we had movies, we had Salvador Dali, it was like incredible time. And then I got became a performance artist down in Lowestoft High Street, Anyway, and then I was lucky, I got rejected again from, for degree applications, etc. And I eventually ended up at Canterbury, which was really good. Canterbury was a heavy steel school, so it was like I ended up in sculpture there.
Yeah.
Anthony Corro was like a heavy influence and tutored us there.
Was he a visiting lecturer? Yeah.
And Richard Rome and lots of Jeff Gibbons and John Gibbons and stuff. Interesting people, but they were really hard formalists. I don't know what I mean, formalists. There was no subject matter to discuss. There was no sense of talking about story or narrative.
Yeah.
That was out. It was form. It was how stuff hits the floor, how you move around it, how that gets you to there, how the eye moves around an object. So it was steel sculpture. But in the middle of that, I discovered Richard Rome's Foundry, bronze casting foundry, which was incredible. And I'm talking about this incredible mixture of materials and all that sort of stuff. And at that point, I didn't know the history of bronze. I just knew these incredible combinations of materials and this weird alchemy that took place in front of you. So I won little scholarships at the college to research bronze and do bronze sculptures. It was incredible. And from that, I got really excited about doing a foundry course and learning bronze. And I could have gone to America to do an MA, but that would not have furthered my chances of making a living. So I was very fortunate in thinking my cleverness was unknown to me at the time, but looking back, it was very clever, where I decided to get a trade in a sense. And I could never cast my own bronzes in my own garage at home, but I could, learn and maybe get a job in a foundry. So I went to the Royal College of Art, and there I met Tisserand Singer, the master founder, the legend, and he took on 2 students a year to teach bronze casting, the old Italian method.
Wow, yeah.
So the history there is really that the Italians, from basically oral traditions back to the Italian Renaissance in Rome and Florence, had these incredible families, and these families developed obviously over hundreds of years. And the Victorian artists, people like Alfred Gilbert, who did Eros, they used to go to Italy to get their stuff cast, and started to say, look, why don't you guys come to London? So these Italian diaspora of families arrived in the late 19th century, early 20th, in London. Fiorinis, the Galizias, the Manzonis, the Angelonis, all these characters turned up and built these foundries. One of them was taken on by Henry Moore and Bernard Meadows, the Angeloni brothers, and they built a foundry at the Royal College of Art, which was the idea was that they would be teaching bronze casters to assist sculptors, and they did affect and influence the whole of British sculpture. The way that bronze cast, this incredible lost wax method, affected the making of objects in liberated form, meant that all that kind of Palazzi and Armitage and Chadwick, all that incredible post-war British art could happen. Frink, all that world was suddenly opened up. Anyway, that's the story of bronze briefly.
Could you just tell us a bit about Tisser and his practice?
So basically, Tisserand Singer was an Angeloni student, and there was about 3 or 4 of them left, and the Angelonis left and died, and Tisser took over the Royal College of Art in about 1972 or something, and he'd gone off after being a student, gone back to Sri Lanka and became a national figure in Sri Lanka. He did all the presidential sculptures. So you go down Colombo High Street and there are all the presidents, and he's done them all. Wonderful stories. And he said he arrived back in London because he was asked, because he was like a devoted student and a great kind of keeper of the knowledge. So he came to be the Master Founder at Royal College of Art and start this Foundry course. And I was one of the last students to go through that system. And we had 2 years of training, basically casting other people's work in a Foundry setting with all the other students there. So I had this wonderful life of being with an MA students and making sculpture in the evenings and casting it up in the daytime with people like Eduardo Palozzi coming in every day and were casting his work, you know, and Brian Neal and Philip King and all these incredible artists. So it was an incredible exposure to an incredible world. But Tissa was a very sociable man, so he made sure that after every bronze pour we had to drink wine. There were Lambrusco nights. We moved into into Bulgarian red, which came on the market and nearly killed us. But there would be fried up goats cooked in kilns. You know, we'd be doing a Greek night where we'd all throw up plates over our shoulders. But he created an incredible sense of community and bondage, and that's the point. And it came out of his magical, kind of mysterious, kind of Sri Lankan ways mixed with the Italian world. But this is the history of bronze casting that I didn't know before, and I'm suddenly a part of a family and a tradition, and I really bought into that kind of sense of history. History became very important, and Tissot used to go around the bins of the Royal College, which is an old, incredible sheds that Isambard Kingdom Brunel supposedly built. They were very famous, the sculpture sheds in Kensington, and they were like prefab. They were the first prefab buildings built for field hospitals in the Crimean War.
Right.
So they were like samples built in the middle of Kensington behind the Natural History Museum. Incredible kind of prefab buildings, wooden and tin and all this amazing stuff. And there was supposedly like a blue whale skeleton underneath us in the Natural History Museum. Scott supposedly left this building to go and do the Arctic. It was just history, every damn corner I turned, you know. And all the great artists that had worked there over the last hundreds of years, you know, Henry Moore and Epstein and everybody, all the trendies, everyone was there. So it was just an extraordinarily fertile time, and Tissa was in the middle of it. And he would go around the bins because they were in demand all the time, and applications and jobs would come in, and in the secretary bin he found this like opportunity to go to India, which they said, and he said, Laurence, this is quite interesting. I said, oh, you should try that, Cholamandal Artist Village in the south of Madras. So I said, I wrote a letter, and then he said, look, why don't you apply for, there's this incredible scholarship you can get, which is about the preservation of Indian monuments and sites and culture. I said, God, you can go and research Indian bronze casting. Huh? Wow. So, damn, blow me down if I got these scholarships, and found myself in the first summer, after immersing myself in Western casting, arriving in India.
Amazing.
And staying in an artist village on a beach, and going to Madras to meet casters in the universities and everything. And before I knew it, I was making art and casting in India. And every time I went somewhere, they said, oh, you must go and see so-and-so in the next state. And I'd end up in Bengal, I'd end up in, eventually got up to Nepal. And but each one had their own specific types of casting. So I had kind of Dokra casting, which was like clay dumbbells where a piece of bronze would be sealed in one piece of clay. A little ash twig would go across to a wax dog or a donkey or something, or an elephant, all sealed up in like a clay dumbbell. Right? You put that in the fire, okay, this is brilliant. Fire gets really, really hot. The clay cooks, and the bronze inside the clay melts, and the wax melts out, and the guy just tips it. And the bronze just travels down the twig, which was burnt out, into the sculpture.
Amazing.
Perfect detail. I'll show you the slides.
Click
it off, amazing. So in South India, they'd use termite sand for covering the waxes because the termites chew the sand in a way that it locks better.
Wow.
In Nepal, they would use rice husks in the second coats to get the aeration. And the way so air could escape from the mold. There was hundreds and hundreds of methods. Bronze would come out of scraps. I mean, I've got a little sculpture up there that came out of a scrap bin in a scrapyard in downtown, Madras, Chennai. And Vijayvalu, my kind of tutor there, said, why don't you have this? I said, well, this is a Deja figure from, turn of the century. He said, no, they're all over the shop with the taps and the,
It was a magical time.
Were there any particular methods that you found in your time there that you still use now, or?
There were not so much now, but certainly I was using ways of degassing bronze, for example, with those willow twigs. There were ways of just degassing stuff, or one knew one could. What it did is give me the confidence to go really low tech, knowing I could get quality out of really low levels of furnaces and moulds and kilns, and how far you can push a process left and right, and how you can absorb mistakes and heat and danger. And there were people out there, I've got photographs, who were pouring, just virtually naked, the sweat on their body would deflect the heat. It was weird, incredible. Nighttime casting, they were casting gods still. You've got to remember, Indians, the whole Indian culture of bronze casting was about pouring idols and gods for temple
sacred
culture. So there was a load of rules, like the flow could not break because it was a lifeblood of a god. You could not pour in the daytime because the daylight you weren't allowed to look and see the gods being made. And it was like the classes here were priest class. They were Brahmin class, and they were called the midwives of the gods. And you'd have eye-opening ceremonies. You could actually open the eyes of a Buddha, for example, up in Nepal or Tibet, in a mirror. You couldn't look him in the face. No one could ever look this sculpture in the eyes. So they had a mirror, and they had to carve the pupils backwards.
Amazing.
And then they'd go in a dark temple, and you'd never actually look. So the whole idea of making a sculpture no one could ever look at, this magical world, this extraordinary, mysterious, magical world. And in Nepal it was a medieval city called Bhutan, which was it was a casting city, I'll call it a city. It was a medieval world, and I would go one day and I'll be working with the take me down one street, and I'd find myself working with the wax makers and the rice husk casters. The next day I'd be with the metal pourers who were getting telegraph wires. Literally, I've got photographs to show you. With the, literally cables from the lines, with the, equivalent to the GPO, melting that down and making sculptures out of that. And then the next day you'd go with that, opening up all the metal finishes. And then the next day you'd go and you'd find the mercury gilders, which is a whole different world. None of them would go over 27 because the mercury was killing them. And then you'd go to the face painters. And then you finally get to the temples in the mountains where the sculptures would be going. Mind-blowing world. So you can understand how bronze casting became a complete and utter world, in which my sculpture and every statement I made would be immersed in that in all those cultural worlds. And we haven't even got to the Bronze Age of Europe. We haven't even got to the fields around here in Suffolk, where axes are found in the ground, hoards of bronze, 3,000 to 4,000 years old. Next to my studio in Butley, there was the Neutral Farm hoard, which was a load of axes. And I went to the museum. I said, "Could you come have a look at these?" And I actually got held axes which were 3,000 years old, and you could see why they were in the bloody field, because they were in a hoard. They were all buggered up. They were bad casting. And to make a connection, to go, "Oh no, poor bloke, he didn't have the metal hot enough. You thought he had a bit of gas there. You can't make any." And you could see desperate measures to try and sharpen the edge of an axe to see if I can get it right. "Oh no, I've buggered up." And it's all the old little ingots and the little, pouring spouts and stuff, all discarded and in a little pile, just ready for this guy to return to, pick out the ground, like a kind of a travelling tinker. Arrives in a village, you want their axes done this year, and he goes, "Okay, I'll go off in the backfield and I'll want the moulds and I'll pour it and I'll come back, I'm a magic guy, But they'd be travelling around on mules and donkeys with all this stuff, and they couldn't carry this gear. It would be left in ground in secret places, and that's what these hoards are. And they are guys that would travel the whole circuit in a year, but they'd loop up they'd overlap like Venn diagrams all over Europe. So that's why you end up with these. I was down in France, and the same axe heads were existing in the museums in France as they were in my Foundry and in my museum, and it was like, God, you can suddenly understand how this networks evolved right through Europe and the world. Just slow permeation of ideas and thoughts, and so that incredible connection to people. You understand exactly what they were doing.
It's preserved as well, isn't it?
Yeah. And then you understand the length and the time of history of bronze, etc. And that I was doing the same thing in Suffolk as that guy was 3,000 years ago, I was doing it in the field next door. You know, it's mind-blowing. So that incredible history, you know, it's the oldest metal. You know, it's the oldest alloy. You know, the first copper was discovered in caves, you know, sweat caves, where they had a fire in a cave and happily, you know, having their tea, and then a drip come down the wall. Like, what the hell is that? You know, it's like, oh, it's ended up at the bottom of the fire, and you get to the bottom of the fire and there's little drips of orange stuff. You know, it's like, what the hell is that? Oh, ouch! You know, before you know it, you know, there's copper from malachite, which is a seam in the rock. You know, this green stuff. You know, it's melted and then they start going, well, if we put that in a pot, put it back in the fire, we can get it. You know, you can pour it into that and get a shape. You know, my God, there's these. They're in Wales. You know, these caves. They're in the Alps, and they start in. You know, they come from Mesopotamia and all this stuff, and that's how it started.
Yeah.
And then the first alloy was arsenic bronze. Arsenic seams existed in the same place as the malachite seams, and they melted in
wow.
arsenic.
Yeah.
Fused and made the copper a little bit harder. So it became like, oh, that's interesting. If you put that with it, before you know it, it's starting to mix other stuff, and you know, and then start to get alloys. You know, over hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. So it's fascinating that kind of is the oldest metal.
Yeah, yeah.
And then you've got to remember that nearly every civilization, nearly every culture has resolved figure some way, resolved their idea of figure. And in that way it's often resolved in metal, and it's really common that it's resolved in copper or bronze. And if that's the case, then it's really enticing and really quite tempting to join that gang, world gang, and go, you know what, you know, I think the figure is where it's at. I think I'm going to work in figure, and I'm going to work in bronze, and I'm going to join my tribe. My tribe are all the figure makers of the world for the last 3,000 years, you know, and that's the story I want to be a part of, and I want to be in Suffolk doing it.
So we are in Lawrence's wax studio in Saxmundham in an old fire station in Suffolk. Laurence, can you just tell us a little bit how you use this room that we're in here?
Yeah, this is what I call a maquette studio. So this is where a lot of ideas originated. It's a bit like a three-dimensional sketchbook. So this is where I can just leave stuff to gestate, sometimes for years, and leave and work. So you can see a lot of work around which has been on the shelf for a long time and survives summers. It's wax, so it survives, well, it doesn't survive summers. So often a lot of stuff just goes, you come in one morning, it's all sagged, slightly left or right, and then you start to understand what you care about and what you don't. So you start to save things. So this is a studio for saving things that are kind of a bit more important than I thought they were.
Yeah. This is a beautiful studio, and it's one of many studios that
Very
you have
messy studio.
set up. Yeah. Can you tell us about one of the first studios that you set up, the Brews Yard? Was it your second Brews Yard?
Yeah. So basically, London wasn't really suiting me in the sense of I couldn't ever get started because there was always obstacles in London. And getting to a place was just a nightmare, and it was very expensive. And we had studios in Arches and stuff, and oft times I'd find my work vandalised or broken into, and you know, acid attacks and that sort of stuff going on. So I decided that I knew in Suffolk, where I came from originally, that there was barns and stuff and lots of farms and etc. that were available to me. Brews Yard suddenly became apparent as an option for me. I phoned up randomly after my final college project was to build a Cellini furnace, a reverberating furnace, I'll have you know, from the Italian Renaissance, which Cellini used to cast his Perseus, which stands in Florence now. There's a very legendary story in the sculpture and bronze casting world. It's in Benvenuto Cellini's autobiography. I decided I wanted to rebuild this reverberating furnace and cast a ton of metal in a field in Snape. And I failed abysmally because I got the wrong fuel, and Cellini was a bit of a kind of a guy that didn't always give away the facts straight, so it was very difficult to follow his instructions anyway. But after that depression and knockback, I phoned up these people in a place called Clockhouse in Brews Yard and said, I heard that there used to be a workshop there, is there any chance to come to see it? And I said, oh, we've been waiting for someone like you. I thought, really? Oh, let's come over. and they were Germans, and they'd got a load of the Berlin Wall, and they were making money out of selling properties as the wall had just come down. So they were in Berlin a lot, and this whole beautiful wall garden was left growing, rambling, and full of rubbish. And there'd been an old art school there run by Bridget Herretz, Gertrude Franconi, and Audrey Pilkington, her mother, Bridget's mother, and they'd all gone, and it was left to rack and ruin. And I was given this workshop, which is in the middle of a wood at the bottom of a field, and full of ancient cars. And I've told you that, you can edit that in. And basically, I could set up my foundry there. So I built, after getting confidence in India and at the Royal College about learning how to get metal hot in dustbins and with hoovers, I started to cast work there. And I was casting work for other sculptors. This was the idea, that I could earn money through casting work for other sculptors. I had a Datsun Sunny, a very cheap car, and I would drive to London every 2 weeks with a boot full of bronze sculptures to give to various sculptors in London, often parts of classes and stuff. It was always good to get a class of people making art, and you could go into the class and you could get quite a few clients. So I'd be driving around London with my bronze casting business, and I pretended I was a big business, so they thought I was a much bigger than I was. But I'd end up with quite a good business, and in the middle of all that, I decided to make a law, and the law was that the kiln would never go on without one of my sculptures in it, because if it did, the bronze casting would take over my sculptural life, and I would forget being a sculptor. So I always had to have one of my bronzes in the kiln, and even if someone like Pelosi had a big show on or something, I would have to get all their work in for a deadline. I'd get the kiln on at midnight, and I'd just turn it and switch on the gas, and I think there's something wrong here. Oh no, I've got to put one of my sculptures in, damn it, I've got to turn the kiln off, and I've got to get it in by the dawn. So you have to stay up all night long, getting a mould ready to put in the kiln, so you keep your law.
So you really didn't break your law?
Never broke, no, that was the absolutely unbreakable law. I could not, eating wasn't necessarily that important, but this bloody mould in the kiln was, and that's what kept my sculpture alive. And at that point I could get hold of the body or a figure, and so I used to find dead animals, deer, hare, rabbits, birds, and I would skin them in the studio, and they'd all lie in them, and I'd model them all. There are images actually. Here's an owl. Actually, this is quite handy. I didn't know that before. And these birds. So this would be like an owl, a barn owl that would exist. I'd get it off the road, and I'd put it in a freezer, and it would freeze into a position. And then I'd get it out and I'd model it really, 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 really carefully, and all the creatures would be modelled, and I ended up with this incredible world of modelled animals, which had this magical quality to them. And I was learning all about observation and modelling, and when I was skinning them as well.
An
anatomy of a hare, a rabbit, a deer, swans, bloody peacock. I did a whole peacock.
How do you fit a peacock in a freezer?
I don't know. It was a big chest freezer. There was cows' heads in there. There was... it was before CJD, before you could go to the abattoir in Bramfield, and you'd get a cow carcass, and the head would be on the floor, and you say, "What can I have it in?" "We have it if you want it." So I'll put it in the back of the fan. Come out a cow's head, which actually is in the top of the kitchen.
That's it.
Yes, it's there. So you'd model a cow's head, just get all this incredible information, and that really helped. So a lot of my figures at that time, when I started to do human figures, I wasn't copying or observing humans, I was doing animals. So they'd have kind of weird kind of thighs or weird kind of wingy kind of arms and stuff, because I was working from nature in a different way. But anyway, that's how the modelling career world started, in the middle of Suffolk. That was all I had as subject matter was dead animals. And then the rats found out. And there was that one morning I came back, and all the hairs that were lying on the wall were all about eaten from about 1.5 foot off the floor. And there had been rats jumping up and biting to a level around the studio wall, So I had half rabbits and half hares, half pheasants to work from. So that's when the freezer got involved.
Anyway, that was like that for a long time. And then I had exhibitions, for example, in a marsh in Aldborough at the slaughterhouse, before that was ever an exhibition space. And so you'd invite other people to a marsh to see my bronzes. And it was that wonderful beginning of a fusion of landscape and my work. And Brugard eventually ended as they sold up and people moved in who were lovely to me, but they said, you've got to leave, this is not good enough. And then I was out with some farmers and I was explaining my problem. We were actually shooting, and that's not a very good thing to talk about here. I said, I've got a problem. He said, what sort of problem have you got, boy? I said, I need a studio. He said, well, I got some cattle sheds. I said, where are they? He said, they're in Laxfield. I said, Laxfield? That's my favourite village, my favourite pub. You know, I drive past it every day to get to Brugard. What do you mean Laxfield? He said, yeah, it's Hugh Farm. I said, that bloody great farm on the hill? He said, yeah, with the moat. I said, yeah, you can have that if you want.
Wow.
I said, really? So I said, okay. So we walked around it. I said, this is ridiculous. Are you really going to let me have this? He said, yeah, you know that. So I moved in, and then I thought this was great. I sat in the bath, my arms behind my head, thinking this is a life. 8 bedrooms. Didn't really think about the rent. It's like when the first rent check came in, rent bill, I thought, oh shit. So I thought I'd better get some people in here. So I started phoning up and going back to London a lot and reconnecting with a lot of my friends and said, look, I've got a moat, I've got barns, I'm building a foundry, I've got bedrooms, £30 a week, you can come and stay if you like, have a studio. And there would be like a guy who was into fishing, so I go, I've got 4 £30 carp in the moat. He goes, what? Yeah, I said, you can fish them out if you want. Said, I'll be there. So he comes down. Then another person said, I've got, perfect, a bit of a foundry for you to cast your bronzes. We don't have to, we can do it together. And piece by piece, in all seriousness, a kind of an art community started, and I began to get people in, and it was fantastic fun. It was brilliant fun. We had such fun. We created these Donatello dinners. We started these with Tissa at the Royal College, where Donatello died. It was the artist that died nearest to Christmas Day, 14th of December, 1635 or whatever. And so we had these dinners in the Foundry where we'd cook all this food in the kiln, and we'd invite 30, 40 people for banquets. I carried those on at Yew Farm, so we had big banquets on Christmas time, and all the village would come, and all my art friends would come, and we'd cook big meals in freezing cold barns. But we created this kind of community.
Yeah, yeah.
And for example, Donatello, Tissa loved Donatello because he would have a basket of money in the studio, and all the workers, when they got hard up, could just lower the basket and take out £5, 5 whatever, florins or whatever it was. And so Donatello was a bit of a hero. People person. Ateliers, studios, This is where it all starts. So I got a load of chocolate money in a basket. I used to hang it from the ceiling, and in the middle of this meal I'd walk on the table, lower the basket and throw chocolate money at everybody as a symbol of, all this sort of stuff. So these are the kind of traditions and the kind of history that I was building for myself in Suffolk, and this is the world that we created this energy, really. And so by the end of 10 years, we were having lots of exchanges. We revitalised the charity Clockhouse Arts Association. We were doing exhibitions. I'd created links with America, and we were doing these incredible residencies in the iron poor exchanges in America. So we were sending artists out to Minnesota, to New Orleans, to Chicago, to New York, and they were coming back. And so we had this vital world, and as well as poet readings, Suffolk Poetry Society, and so many combinations. I don't know how I did it. I don't know how it happened. I've got no idea now how the hell I found the time to do all that.
I was going to say, how did you find managing all of those projects and that community alongside your creative?
I think it must have been utterly chaotic. But I just think I had there's a bit like that rule in the kiln. It's got to be done. If you're up. It's a way of life. It's not a living. It's just a completely absorbing way of life. I mean, we built potato cannons. And we had a British potato cannon competition. We were firing potatoes over fields, and we developed sugar beet cannons. It was like, I don't know how it all happened, but we created this world. And then we had in a wonderful village, and the Low House pub was our centre, and we all met, and it was just a really lovely 10 years.
Yeah.
But we had to leave.
Yeah.
the landlord's going to look at you, Christ, I never expected you to, what the hell happened there? Yeah, it's got up to speed after about 10 years going, oh, for God's sake, there are the carp in the bath. It's like, there's sheep in bedrooms, what is going on? So we got chucked out basically, they sold up, and then the East Anglian got involved and said, look, you become quite a thing, where are you going next? And I said, well, we don't know. And
Is
they
this
said,
the newspaper?
Yeah. And this, after quite a few farms and people got in touch, which was very touching, this place called Butley Mills got in touch, and I knew from my childhood cycling out around the marshes of Suffolk, I knew Butley Mills. It was an extraordinary mill in Butley near Woodbridge in Orford.
Mm-hmm.
And I went down and it was this extraordinary, the swine flu. They used to feed 7,000 pigs from this mill, and they all had to be put down because of swine flu. 7,000 pigs. They were heartbroken people.
Yeah.
And Glyn Evans, who was the manager, said, look, do you want to come in? They got the bloody wheels. They got, the water mill. The pond would feed the mill. And there was like diesel history. There was like old water history. Leather hinges on walls, door floors going through, shoes coming in. It was just an extraordinary oak, flooring, wheels going, looking over the marshes down. It was just an extraordinary place. And I said, look, it's full of sawdust. If I come in this studio, I've just destroyed one farm. If I come in this, I'm going to destroy this extraordinary place. I'd love to be here, but we're going to destroy me. I don't want to be involved. He said, okay, well, what about the barns opposite on the marsh? I said, what do you mean, what about the barns on the marsh? I said, yeah, they're available if you want to come in. I said, well, yeah, let's go for it. And I walked out and onto the back of these seed sheds and these more grain stores and chicken sheds. We went out to the back, and just this estuary, this kind of Butley Creek, just opened up this marsh with reeds and this world, which was my world. Really, it was my world. It was the world I most identified with, the landscape that I really responded to.
You said before that you felt you had landed. When you had
exactly.
arrived there.
I sat there on the side of this bank, looking out into this little marsh area coming over. I could hear curlew. And I thought, God, this is, when you're 14 walking around those places, you kind of plant seeds must start, mustn't they? And it was just like all those seeds were like germinating again. There was like, whoa. And it was like, Christ, if I can make art in this place, I can't think of really any other fantasy life that I could want, So we transferred a whole load of artists from Laxfield to Butley, the ones that could make the journey, the ones that wanted to come, and it was a difficult emotional time. And a new artist came and joined us there. We didn't have a house to live in, so it was much more difficult to create that kind of incredible community. We also didn't have a village, but we still had the dinners, we still had the parties, we still had iron pours, we had an incredible life. And it was at that point that I really got involved with the marsh and making figures. Really, I began to find my language working with figure. And the Creek Men were the first. Really, I got to the age of about late 30s, and I thought my 40th birthday's coming, and really, Laurence, you've got to really start doing something that means something. So I started to make these 8-foot men and challenge myself to casting these guys. And so I made these 8-foot figures, these giants, these kind of eldritch, kind of chthonic characters that kind of emerged from the marsh and the mud. And for no reason other than I wanted to make them and prove that I could make an 8-foot man,
And the things that you use when you're building are quite often from the marsh, so you use a lot of organic material.
Yeah, very much so. Is often so my kind of way of incorporating landscape and the whole history of the land into my work is to actually impregnate the whole figure with the marsh. So this is all the reed bed, and this is everything is in this sculpture. So it's draping down. There's like this long kind of washing line almost of draping organic material. This is called After the Flood. It's the idea that the water level is raised and what's left is this kind of detritus from the landscape. So it's the way in which you can identify what's going on almost in the landscape through this character. It's almost like a monitor, almost like a recorder of event. So this figure's becoming almost a passive kind of witness to landscape. And this was the thinking that was going on with the work. And you have these kind of stick carriers, these in the middle of the marsh you get this idea of a man carrying sticks, but you don't know whether he's retrieving them from a wreckage, from the marsh maybe, or whether he's going to be building stuff with them. So he's this kind of, my figures are now beginning to represent a threshold between events, between something that might be salvaged and destroyed, and he's saving it, or he's a destroyer that he's taking from nature, and that kind of narrative is beginning to evolve in the work, and it kind of culminates at that phase in the creep men, where I make these mudmen basically, which are then taken on a voyage. I decide to go, and I was having interesting times at the Opera Festival at the time, and I was trying to get involved with them, and they were not quite that keen, but they were nice to me, but they were nicely saying, Laurence, we want an international artist, not, you're a nice guy, but very kind, but no. So I decided to actually say, no, I'm going to take my sculptures to the Opera Festival by the river, which is the river I knew from my childhood. So I made a raft, and here's the raft. So this is a raft. It was a polystyrene raft. I used to go in the Thoughtless raft race when I was a kid, and I understood raft culture. So the raft, and this raft I took to the boatyard in Aldborough, Upson's boatyard, and Brian Upson said he could tow me to Snape with these figures. So the creep men were going to take to the water, and here's their digger, which they load the boats with, and you can see this ropes and stuff. It was all very strange. On the side of this quay in Aldborough, and they were lowered onto the raft, and we were going to set sail. And the first day, I was really excited and didn't realise how strong the current was, and we were having coffee on the raft with them. And I thought I'd just see what it's like to set off.
Really?
Bloody hell. We went through a sailing club. All the people on the side had to stick their feet out and kick off the yachts as we were tumbling through this bloody marina. And the guy, Mr. Upson, was coming the other way with his boat. Thank God. He lassoed us and pulled us back to shore. So that was the first night.
Were they all standing as this?
They were all standing on this bloody thing. So the next day we set out on the journey, and here they are, travelling through Icon, like kind of Theban kings, they were an extraordinary journey, going through from Aldborough to Snape. Yeah. And eventually, this is for me a kind of an iconic image really, of the arrival. It's almost like coming off the Amazon Delta or the Danube. And I just love the idea of the expanse of Suffolk, and my whole subject matter is kind of in one place. There's my sculptures, there's me, there's the landscape, there's the people I'm working with, there's a moving island of Suffolk coming into the Aldborough Festival. And then we parked this right in front of the Aldborough Festival as the opening night of the festival. And these characters were on the tide, so they would rise above the reeds, look in, and then go back down again at low tide, So they were controlled by the moon, and the stars. And so they became a kind of the festival was really kind of good, and said, you've done this, well done. Why don't you, and so they really celebrated it, and it became a big thing that year. Yeah. They came in on the spring high tide, and you couldn't leave till October, autumn high tide. So they were stuck there for 6 to 8 months.
Yeah, part of the landscape, and also really activated.
They did, and the footpath down to it became very trodden, and they became, then people said they should stay and all that sort of stuff, and but they didn't.
Have you got pictures of the?
They were low tide.
Beautiful.
So that was a kind of idea of the fusion of Suffolk and my sculpture and the figure. That was a perfect kind of fusion. Here we have the first ever sculpture that I did, this maquette with kind of matter from the marsh just stuck on it. It was literally just a kind of a very primitive statement of like my intent really. is the idea that landscape and figure can be fused if you just squash them together and start a journey, just find out what happens, you know. And that's what's evolving now. That's what we're doing now. It's kind of arrived at the Yoxman, this 26-foot high figure in the middle of the Suffolk Fields. And here we have, just these kind of organic figures, almost like these lightning rods, almost like igniting them in the marshes. So these could stand in the marshes, for example, and kind of like summon kind of like a lightning strike, you know, summon.
Are these maquettes or are they?
These are maquettes, yeah. And this is a maquette for the Beast of Burden. Again, it's a very natural object, but figure. But he became the altarpiece at Blythburgh Church. So on the altar at Blythburgh Church is this 14-foot wide, reeded kind of stick character that kind of is the altarpiece underneath this giant window in Blythburgh. So one of the greatest churches in Suffolk has got this primeval. It's the cathedral of the marshes out there. You know, so all the marshland is summoned in this sculpture on the altar. So I've had these wonderful opportunities to kind of sign my fate, seal the deal, as it were, with my relationship to nature and architecture and history in this region.
I just wanted to point out this is a perfect example of how the human form becomes kind of part of something else. Could you tell us a bit about?
Yeah, well, these are brand new kind of ideas that I've been doing this Walking Men series for a long time, and you'll see in the next studio these 8-foot walking men. But I've got these maquettes, and that's the beauty of this way of working. I can cast 4 or 5 figures and put them in different environments. And I've been really enjoying cladding my figures in wood, etc., especially through lockdown, where it's kind of idea of building in a kind of a carapace around yourself to protect yourself. These kind of human beings are having to protect ourselves all the time. Well, this carapace, this kind of tessellation of space, which I've been using here with wax and wood, I've started to think about it in landscape terms and actually trying to evoke things like water. So these kind of people become waders, and this is almost like a sculpture of water. And you can see behind you here, there's another one where these characters are like almost floating down rivers. So this is a character that's, I imagine him really big and this like 20 foot long, so you get this whole sense of water and water is a very kind of philosophical thing. It's an energy and a kind of sense of flow, and there's a lot of language around it that I really like. Going to the flow and a subconscious world that's underneath it, and the world on top, and what can be contained by water, and the kind of consciousness in water is very interesting. So it ties with that Suffolk. You know, Suffolk, I've always felt is made 10 times bigger. It's a small area, but made 10 times bigger by all the water inlets. There's no bridges. You have to go 10 miles from 2 places, like, you know, Orford to Aldborough, which is only a mile away.
Southwold to Walbersby.
Southwold to Walbersby. You know, you've got. It's ridiculous, but it makes Suffolk massive and mysterious and interesting. And so that kind of journey of water through this landscape is something that I've always, and the ocean, of course, and the cliffs and the erosion of our land. This is the outside coming in. You've got the winter foliage here. In the summer it's lush green, you know, it just takes over the whole studio, which is an old fire station, and this is the engine room. So there was 2 fire engines in here, and I've got books of photographs of the old fire engines from 1915. That room that we've just been in was the first fire station.
Really?
And they have the old pump truck, and there's pictures. I'll show you the pictures. Pump truck of them, the guys standing there with the pumps and all the little hats and stuff, you know. And it's that room. It's incredible. And then it grew, and this was developed in the 60s. And if you go to watch Fireman Sam, you'll see the same design on the doors. And the doors have still got all the labels. So you've got lecture room, uniform room, store room, office, and it's lovely. So it's all original features. So I'm very privileged and lucky to have it. But yeah, this is my main modelling studio. This is where the figures are modelled. So these are 8-foot figures, and actually they're not modelled here actually. I go up to 6 foot here because I can't get 8-foot figures moved safely to Halesworth, which is where my foundry is. So I model up to 6 foot figures here. So there's a lot of figures that have been done. from the stick carriers to
Yeah.
to the walking men and to many figures. All the borrowed breath figures, all that stuff is from here. And really, here is where I've got privacy, silence. It's actually a remarkably quiet place. The Foundry at Halesworth is very, very noisy. It's like a roadworks cross with a dentist. And it can drive you crazy, and it's very difficult to think in. So I go there and I'm very active, but here I do a lot of my thinking, and I sit in this chair and I model forms. And the mirrors here are really quite important. You may think I'm the vainest man in the world, but basically they're all angled slightly, down, up and around, and they all focus on a point. So if I'm working here on a figure, I'm not doing self-portraiture, but I'm finding the equivalent to myself. So, not myself, a kind of a psyche, a kind of a human psyche. And often I will have a problem with the back of an elbow or something, and if I get in the right place in the mirrors, I can just look at that and I can go, okay, you're working like that, or I can get other mirrors that come around, and then you begin to get angles of sides of ears, kneecaps. I won't go into detail, but you can get lots of backs of things sorted out in this space. And it's the right time of year. I'll do it more often if it's warmer. But you know, there's often a very strange sight in here, I can assure you. So it's all very important for me, so I can get figures worked out. But I don't want to. I've had models before, and the model will become kind of very distracting actually, because you end up saying, "Oh, you've got such a fantastic shoulder blade." I just get completely absorbed in a shoulder blade, or you know, a kneecap or a rib. But you end up becoming a model of almost like an illustrator of the form. I'm not really wanting to create brilliant life studies. I want to get into the psychology of being in this world. And my journey to that place is through clay, which again has got an extraordinary history. I won't bore you with that one, you've already had too much of that. But you know, clay figures, etc., from the Greeks to it's something that's a massive history to it. And so I again really am happy to engage in that history. I don't want to move on to high-tech, rapid prototyping. I don't want to get scanned people in here and work from scanned bodies or anything. I want to model, I want the journey. I'm not a life caster. I'm not making moulds of human bodies and then using them. I'm going through a whole journey of making humans.
Making a lot of your kind of your marks and expressions in the way that you make. You were talking about not being an illustrator, but and there was a modeller that you did casts from. I can't remember his name. Was it Brian?
Brian.
And
okay,
his aesthetic and the way that you use your hands.
So Brian Taylor. Was an incredible sculptor that I was really privileged. I knew about Brian Taylor when I was a student. He was a kind of another one of these characters who taught at Camberwell, and he was one of the great Slade sculptors. A Slade in the 50s and 60s had this incredible tradition with Ewan Uglow and William Coldstream of the kind of way of working and a way of looking and a way of observing. It was very kind of, and modellers like Brian had incredible knowledge of anatomy. He became a Roman scholar. He went to Italy himself. He's bought a house in Italy, lived there for many years, came back to London and taught at Camberwell, and just developed an incredible language. And I was very fortunate to him. I think we kind of connected. And he said, look, can you cast my work? So I thought, yeah, I'm doing that. Dutton Sam is gone, we've got a Volvo now, I look pretty good, I can travel, take your work backwards and forwards. And the minute I started to cast his work, I understood where my sculpture had all its deficiencies. I was suddenly... when you're finishing someone else's work, you move in the way sometimes, if you're lucky and they're a great sculptor. You suddenly find yourself making moves and gestures around a form, and you suddenly think, God, I'm used to making stuff like that, but this is like that. It's like, and it's as simple as that. That's a lesson. That was a lesson. And you've got to go around it to finish off and hammer this and nail that and weld this, and you've got to suddenly you're in a different world of someone else's reach. Someone else's sense of volume and expanse and size and scale, and you suddenly absorb, very osmotically, someone else's way of working and the space they inhabit, their physicality. And then these incredible faces and expressions in the way he just captured screams and kind of abuse and kind of trauma, kind of incredible stories about people that had, out of the spike of homeless hostels would come into a studio and sit there, laughing madly, and he would model them, and they'd kind of live in his studio. Or Lily Peer, who was a woman that was, losing her mind, had so much trauma in her life, would be in his studio, and she'd be madly just crying her eyes out in his studio and dancing around him like a stork, and suddenly model her. We'll show you fit photographs. Model her, And so he brought me into this other world of how the studio becomes this place where life unfolds and stuff. And I took a different route. I chose to do standing figures which should expand in different ways. But he really taught me, without actually teaching, if you know what I mean, just by being with him and being in his presence and just spending time, he really became a massive influence. And so I was really fortunate to absorb a massively important way of making, which you can never learn, and no one ever teaches modelling in that sense anymore.
And just going back again, I know that Cara was obviously a huge influence at the time in that way of thinking, and we spoke about it a bit earlier, and there was not so much value in narrative. I'm just wondering, how did you kind of depart from that and end up with the human form being your main source of inspiration, and also the narrative that you have in your work as well?
Well, I did start at Canterbury. Another great modeller called David Thompson, who was, funny enough, a contemporary of Brian's, that's probably why I knew about Brian, at Canterbury, taught me how to do portraiture quietly, almost. I'd say, you think I can model clay? He said, well, what, really? What makes you think that? No one does that around here. I said, well, I think I might be quite good at it, actually. Well, why do you think that? I said, I think I can do it. I've got a feeling for it. He said, well, try it. So, oh my God, my hands do like it. And he goes, well, look, let's get it proper. Let's do it how we did it at the Slade. Let's get a thing, get a model. They gave me a model. And before you know it, they gave me calipers, and it was like, right, there's left, right, left, do a skull first, now work up from the skull on the cheekbones, and they were like, and observe and turn around. Before you know it, you're kind of building a head. It's like, oh my God, this is happening. And then he said, like, this is how you make a mould. And it was incredible, almost secret classes that I'd be taking. And I kind of thought, oh, this is really nice, this is humanity, this is a face. And then I'd go home, and my granddad was still alive. And he was a character. He was a singer, a butcher and a singer. So I'd go and see him. I said, "Can I do your head?" There's one down there actually. He fell asleep, and I said, "Can I do your head?" So I turned up and he said, "Yeah." I said, "I'm beginning suddenly to get human people in my life, human stories. People telling me stories while I'm trying to do his head." So my first ever real portrait is a photograph in there actually of my grandfather, my first head. But this is how I began to understand that actually humanity is interesting, and the steel formal language was very important. It's a bit like musical scales. You have to have a structure which you work toward, and it is very evident in this work. All that formalness is there, but now there's a narrative thread that it inhabits, and I've been able to fuse the two. So my human bodies now take on journeys. They are the beginnings of journeys which often end up in a formal arrangement. And here we have an 8-foot man that was the original sculpture for the Man of Stones. So he was made from the Man of Stones. But now you've got a mould of a man, an 8-foot man, and he's standing quite simply. You can do things, you can attack him, you can abuse him, So I'm very interested in the process of bronze, as you know, and I'm very interested in the fact that I work in skins. So bronze is very thin, my skin is very thin. My skin is the border between the inside of me and the outside of me. The wax skin is the border between the inside of the body and the outside of the world. We live on a planet where we live on a skin between space and Earth. So that kind of idea of the band, the atmospheric layer, the band that we represent ourselves through, we judge each other by, is very, very important. And the fact that I'm alluding to content, to mass, to gut, to bone, to muscle through 1/4 of an inch layer of surface is mind-blowing. So I thought I'd play around with that. So we get a wax man, which is all alluding to all that stuff, and then I start to incise, surgically cut out bits of this skin man And here we have the first cut with a knife and a hot knife in wax. You see all these dribbles coming down where the wax has melted when I'm cutting. And I thought, I know, I'm going to stick it on the side. I thought, no, I'll do it again. I'll cut that leaf out and stick it on that side. And then I'm going to do it again. And I keep on cutting out leaves of this character, portals, windows, to see inside of him. And there's nothing there. What a big reveal that is, you know. It's kind of philosophical in itself. And turn him into something else. Slowly he evolves into, well, hedge, tree, but flock, swarm, gas, miasma, fog, shoal. He just becomes many, many things, which is mind-blowing, especially when you're making it and you suddenly get to a point where you haven't got quite there yet with this sculpture, it's halfway through. But there'll be a moment when you kind of unlock the figure, he suddenly goes and disappears into a mass. And that's an amazing moment for you physically, because you know, you're by yourself here and there's nothing going on and you suddenly go, God, what happened to the man?
Yeah.
You know, it's like, that's the feeling, that's the relationship that I want with the sculpture. But all that time, he's getting weaker and weaker, and he's needing structure. So I'm going into the woods and I'm getting a stick, and I'm propping him up, creating this internal scaffold. So we end up bizarrely creating a kind of internal skeleton that supports this weird leafy world. And now that language again, that kind of formal sculptural language from my history is coming back out. All that linear steel stuff that I used to do is returning with bindings, string and everything, and this kind of structure, and it will continue to grow. Eventually, I reckon, if I carried on, it'd be a great show to see figure going from leaf man to literally stick man. Just to a stick frame that's left at the end of this long thinking process. Because really that's what it is, you're thinking through action, you're thinking through hand, you're thinking through physicality.
Yeah.
So basically, when I was a kid around Snape, the Snape burials were very important to me, and they were happening, excavations were happening when I was a child. So I'd go, well, teenager, about age 15 or whatever, to the excavation in Snape, and there were these burial mounds, and they were being excavated, and they found what they call sand bodies, which is basically the rotting body when it's going, all the fluid and stuff, leave a darker stain. So our archaeology is not about objects, it's about stains, which is fascinating.
Yeah.
So it's a bit like a waste mould when you're a sculptor. You peel away a layer to get a sculpture, and you always leave a blue bit of plaster or something. And when you've hit the blue, you know you've got near the sculpture, so you don't go too hard and hit the sculpture. So you kind of excavate with a pin or a little pick to get to the final bit of sculpture. But it's the same thing with their archaeology. They have yellow sand, and when they hit black sand, they know they've got body. So you start to excavate, and you just, when you get to black, you stop. And then eventually you end up with a body in sand. And then you go and invite the public to come and see it. And there's me on the top of the grave looking down, and there are bodies of black people all hunched up and, you know, sitting in the bottom of pits, and it's just like, Christ. But then the other half of it is going, I want a suit of armour. You know, I live in a really boring county. You know, you go to Leicester, you get King Richard under a car park. When you go, you know, here you get, you know, he's not even bloody sword. Then you begin to find out that, you know, Sutton Hoo was existing and all that sort of stuff, and there is a world which is quite extraordinary. But I got a feeling that kind of sand body moment when their body was so ephemeral and so ethereal that it planted a very deep seed in me, and you got that kind of ethereal ephemerality here. Yeah. But you also got the need to make a more permanent body, to make something that will last, that will survive, and be metal later on, like the accents 3,000 years later. So my departure from Butley, my kind of emotional departure, I had to go because things were getting too big and chicken sheds weren't doing it for me anymore. I had to leave a wonderful community of people, and obviously the landscape that had created me. So I decided to make an offering, which was, you know, a bit egotistical, but you know, what the hell. So I made a life-size lying man, and I laid him out, floated him out onto the river, and I lowered him into the mud, and he lays there in the mud, and he's slowly sinking. And he'll be archaeology in 1,000 years' time. So this metal man is lying and sinking, and it's called 1,000 Tides. and he's sinking under the mud. And he's joining the Saxon world, he's joining the Bronze Age world, he's becoming another layer of history and narrative and story. And that was a very emotional, powerful time. To leave that and to rebuild my life again in Halesworth, a more industrial setting. So you're arriving at Halesworth thinking, okay, I've just done this very poetic thing, and here I am with the lorry park pallets and skips.
Well, there's a lot going on the industrial estate.
And how do you compete with that world? How do I make an impression here? How do I live here? And within a year, we were making a 26-foot high man.
We are here in Yoxford, just off the A12 in front of Cockfield Hall, and behind us is the magnificent Yoxman. Laurence, can you tell us how Yoxman came about?
Yeah, well, it's a culmination. It's basically comes from the Creekman, really. I mean, it's the end of the road for the Creekman shape, the image, the kind of the form that I created, and he's kind of the climax of an idea. My patrons, patrons, the guys that bought the Creekman own this estate, and they wanted to have a kind of epitomised Suffolk, have a Suffolk character in a sense, representing the land and the landscape and its history, and as a part of their whole project here, the Wilderness Project, where they're planted, a million trees, are restoring landscape for as far as the eye can see, thousands of acres, to create a kind of a leisure world of industry, places to stay and things like that. So this is a part of that whole project.
He's magnificent. We were just walking up here and he seems to get bigger as you get closer to him actually, and you can see him from the drive up the A12. You were talking about the materials that he's being made from, and we saw in your studio some really nice designs and colours from Cove Hide, from the beach, and you can see them here in where you've made them.
Yeah, they're very much, this is very, if you're going to make a sculpture about the land, it struck me that really where the history of the land is most visible, or most present, or most evident, is on the coast. We've got this incredible eroding coastline where the sea is just taking a bit of us every day, and out of that wall of sand we often find bone and stick and history kind of revealing itself, mammoth tusks, megalodons and shark teeth, all that kind of millions of years of history of the Suffolk landscape is there. So that's the place where I'd find, all the resource and all the evidence that I need to make a sculpture about land, and about the loss of land, and about erosion, and about where we are at the moment. And really this figure is about, he's not a triumphal figure, he's not a figure that's kind of striding the landscape in all his glory. He's a guy that's kind of reticent, unsure, kind of uncertain about his place in the world, and really to make him of eroding land and sand and all that sort of stuff, it's kind of right that we are of the land that we are a part of. We exist here and depend upon it, and we will erode just like the land if we're not careful. So in a funny sort of way, I've kind of made a kind of an environmental statement, really, which I'm quite chuffed. It kind of grew really out of 4 years of work, as I think, and this sculpture is encapsulated 4 years of development, so it's like it's covered Brexit, it's covered COVID, it's covered issues where statuary has been removed from towns now. Men of old, who've had dodgy histories have been taken down and thrown into the ocean. So for me to be making big male figures in the landscape is an interesting time to be doing it. So there's no point in creating figures that celebrate machismo and the kind of the white male. It's time to be reflective, and I hope this figure who's looking down to the ground, uncertain, hasn't got a mouth, is kind of just inward looking and inward thinking, is about right for where we are at the moment, I think.
Even with his size, there's a gentleness about him as well. We're just talking about his stomach, and it's a sunny day today, and to touch he's quite warm actually. He has a warmth to him which is very nice.
Yeah.
And how tall is he exactly?
He's 26 feet. 26 feet. So he was cast in 50 sections, 50 metre wide sections at the Foundry.
And how did you get him here?
Very big cranes and an Arctic lorry. There was 2 massive cranes, 300-ton cranes, and a lorry that loaded it up at the hills of Foundry and brought it here. And we had to dig a road to it down there, and the crane had to lift him over, so he kind of levitated and travelled through space to get here and literally land. And underneath there's 8-metre piles, steel bars going down as tall as him into the ground, arriving at concrete tables at the top of them, and he's bolted to those concrete pads. So he's got to withstand 80-mile-an-hour winds and not flex. And if we didn't have that structure inside him, he'd just collapse at the kneecaps. You've seen how thin wax and the bronze is. So it's just really a giant tin can with an illusion, creating those illusions we were speaking about earlier of density and mass.
And he's sitting on a mound here, and this is from the lake?
This is the spoil of the lake, yeah. So it's wonderful. It's now higher than the road. Before that he was lower. Which is great. I think it'd be worth seeing the back of him to get the sense of this cliff. So this kind of guy is half oak as well as half land. And here you can see the kind of burrs you get on oak trees where there's disease, and often there's points with little bits of wood poking in, almost like infected splinters, you know. So this whole guy is about, you know, suffering in a sense, vulnerability, disease. You know, it's not very cheerful.
Well, you use your hands a lot to build your sculptures. Did you use, because of the scale of him, did you use other tools as well as your hands?
The interesting thing, this is full of my hand marks. This is full of finger gestures, and even inside the thighs I've put these almost like cave painted, you know, these first ever symbols of men. I've put them inside almost like a cave inside his legs. But I use saws, chisels, axes, shovels, massive rasps, all manner of things to make this guy, going up and down on my lifting platform with buckets of plaster, throwing them on him and working on it as fast as possible before it sets. So there's loads of dribbles, and I just love dribbles. I just love anything that dribbles. I'm looking forward to the seagulls starting to work on this. But I just love the stuff, you know, you'll see coming down these kind of runnels of liquid that are kind of traversing this topography really of body, this kind of contours of land and mass. But the other arm is branch, and this arm is more human. It's more a hand at this side, so it's like a journey through it from natural object to kind of proto-human.